So good evening and welcome. We're so very happy that you're joining us. It's the first in-person event for a while, so it's a little new but old. I'm so happy that you can join us on this most important topic. It's okay? On this very important topic as part of the Small Arms Survey's Security Assessment in North Africa, SANA project. I'm Emilia Dungel. I'm the Small Arms Survey's lead editor and communications coordinator, and it is truly an honor and a pleasure to moderate today's event out of Libya, opening safe pathways for vulnerable migrants stuck in Libya. Our featured SANA experts this evening are Jalel Harchaoui. I practiced so much before we started. I think that's the thing. If I had just gone further, it would have been
Don't practice too much.
Yeah, exactly. And Jalel is an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. We are also joined by Jérôme Tubiana, who is the Migration Libya Advocacy Manager for Médecins Sans Frontières, the Doctors Without Borders. So thank you both so much for being here. It's going to be a great conversation, I think. So we're here on the sidelines of the 2022 SANA Experts Meeting, and we're going to talk about Libya. So the SANA project was actually conceptualized to follow developments after the Arab Spring, including the fall of Gaddafi, so this topic remains forever relevant. And as dynamics continue unfolding, we continue monitoring and analyzing them. So tonight we're here to discuss specifically the issue of migrants in Libya. Our discussion takes as its starting point the Doctors Without Borders report out of Libya, opening safe pathways for vulnerable migrants stuck in the country. It's the name of the event, but we're also going to broaden beyond that. So against the backdrop of the report, we will discuss challenges facing migrants in Libya, possible pathways, but also more about the context more broadly, implications of the issue at the international, regional, local levels, and possibly future issues as a result. And we're also going to take into consideration lessons we've learned from previous or ongoing work, including from SANA, that can provide food for thought. So I think we're going to jump right in, and we thought we would start with Jalel. If you could talk a little bit about the context of this issue. You guys can let us know if the mic is okay.
Thank you, Amelia. Thank you very much to Small Arms Survey and SANA for their support through the years. What I wanted to try and do now is pretty much set the stage for Jérôme's presentation. I think what his report sheds light upon is an entire system that is compromised. And it's not always the analysis that you see out there when you read writings on this topic of migrant abuse and organized crime in general in Libya. So what I wanted to do is basically try to situate this particular activity, which consists in basically managing, quote unquote, the flow of human beings through Libya, and situate in general this whole notion of running an entire portfolio of illicit activities. So really speaking from an organized crime perspective, just remind you of how central organized crime actors have become in Libyan political life. So hopefully I will be able to convey this notion that is not binary at all. There's no bad guys on the one hand and a weak state on the other. That's obviously a completely false idea, and so that would be then useful to keep in mind and to listen to Jérôme. Obviously, Libya is very wealthy, much wealthier than Tunisia or Egypt or Sudan on a per capita basis. It's a small population with huge amounts of wealth. Of course, we all think of the hydrocarbons extraction industry that generates typically when you don't have a blockade like we have now. Right now, there's the eastern factions are imposing deliberately an oil blockade that costs roughly 100 million euros a day. In other words, 3 billion euros a month voluntarily for political motives. But if you don't have that, you typically have somewhere between $20 billion and $55 billion generated on a decent year, on a good year. So it oscillates based on the price of the barrel, of course, on the international markets. But there's another source of wealth, which is the very geographic location of that particular territory. And that allows you to generate wealth as well if you get involved in smuggling and trafficking, including that of humans. So I encourage you to visualize Libya as basically a territory that is dominated by a lot of small-time criminals, of course, but you also have, I would say, 3, 4, maybe 5 large, very well-run organized crime networks. And they're all involved in roughly the same set of illicit activities. Only the relative proportion of each activity will change from one network to another. So you could imagine one network that kind of puts emphasis on a particular activity, but is still involved in the others, and maybe another one will have another preference, but will also be involved in the others. So what are the activities? I'm not going to include the smuggling of crude oil because it's minor. It's very difficult to export crude oil out of Libya on a legal basis. It exists, but it's not big enough to be mentioned. So what you have is effectively drug trafficking. We all heard of Captagon, hashish, more and more of anecdotal quantity of cocaine. You have exportation of scrap metals. You have the transit of gold, facilitating the management of this exportation of gold, although the gold in question is not extracted out of Libya. Libya has gold, but it's not being extracted right now. You have, of course, overpriced service contracts that armed groups are able to secure from the state. So the state will ask them to, let's say, fix a road. Maybe the road will be fixed. Maybe the road will not be fixed at all, but the price will be huge. So this is one form of transfer of wealth from the formal agencies and ministries of the state to armed players. You have, of course, a militia dynamic, which means that the foot soldiers of a given armed group are not necessarily controlled. Maybe on the side, in some extracurricular manner, will get involved in kidnapping for ransom. You cannot really stop them because maybe their salary is too low, so you can basically allow them to use the banner of the militia to do those extra activities on the side. And of course you have human smuggling, but also probably much more important, fuel smuggling. Libya has refineries, but imports a lot of diesel and gasoline products created. So the one thing that I would ask you to kind of bear in mind is that those actors are not parasites. They have also, the ones that have really displayed serious longevity, those organized crime networks have also grown over the years a portfolio of very positive, socially useful skills and capabilities. They are able to project power in the name of state organs, and those functions are precious, valuable, and useful. So you basically, the communities like them for their capabilities, and they use that positive aspect in order to pursue on the side the negative activities, the illicit activities. So you should not think of those largest organized crime networks as basically operating as strict parasites vis-a-vis Libyan society. In fact, if you were to remove them suddenly, you would destabilize entire communities and hurt a lot of vulnerable and innocent civilians. So this is the shrewdness that has characterized the players that have been able to survive over the last 11 years. And of course, so it's basically a blackmail logic. They do useful stuff for the state. The state institutions use those people, and that because those activities those services for the state are useful and precious, it gives them the ability to pursue negative and criminal activities on the side. So here I'm basically condemning one frequent analytical error is to believe that the Libyan state happens to be weak, and unfortunately you have bad guys outside of the state institutions that we should remove from Libya. That's not true. The bad guys happen to also fulfill very good and useful functions, so it makes the situation much more complicated from a policy making and even from an analysis perspective. To go back to what has happened over the last year or so, or the last couple of years, I say 2 years because there hasn't been any major exchange of fire, no major war-fighting episode in Libya for the last 25 months, since early June 2020. And there's basically presence of Turkey in the northwest of Libya. I prepared this map. You can see the green part is the quote-unquote pro-Turkey factions, and you see that they have like those yellow islands in northwestern Libya. So you have an anti-Turkish sentiment, to simplify the situation here, anti-Turkish sentiment within northwestern Libya, an area that is incorrectly very often described as a pro-Turkish enclave. The Turks are there militarily, but they're not liked by everybody. You have armed groups that are determined to weaken Turkish influence. And then you have, of course, the pro-Haftar or the pro-Egypt part of Libya, and you see here the Russian presence is still a reality to this day. So the Ukraine war has not caused I would say somewhere around 2,500 mercenaries of Russian nationality to suddenly leave Libya. They're still there, they're sticking to a low profile, they're trying to not get noticed, but they're still there. And what matters here is basically the fault lines, the way they have changed within northwestern Libya, which means effectively that when you hear about an episode like May 17th, when I'm implying here that you know that there are 2 prime ministers in Libya right now since March. You have the incumbent Prime Minister Abdelhamid Dbeibeh in Tripoli, who's trying to stay in power. He has been there since March 2021. And then you have another one that was designated by the Eastern Parliament on March 1st, Fathi Bashara, who's from the West, but is now currently sitting in the coastal city of Sirte, and would love to penetrate Tripoli and topple the incumbent Prime Minister, replace him, and be the unique Prime Minister for the entirety of Libya. And he has not been able to succeed in that so far. On May 17th, there was a dramatic day in Tripoli where Fathi Bashara, the designate of the parliament, was actually physically in Tripoli for a few hours, and there was violence. So there was a violent incident because he tried to basically carry out a coup. He withdrew, but this kind of incident could happen again. So what's interesting here is to ask yourself, what has been the attitude of those 2 prime ministers vis-a-vis organized crime actors in general, and knowing that each organized crime empire has within its suite of activities this notion of managing detention centers, and within each detention centers you have obviously a recurring use of abusive practices and human rights violations. Well, Dbeibeh has not tried to seriously crack down on the biggest actors since he got to power in March 2021. There was some genuine patrols in the area of Gharian and Tarhuna, but if you look at the bigger centers like Sabratha and Zawiya, not even an attempt. So basically a laissez-faire attitude to try to basically stay in power without creating too many, without trying to rock the boat, trying to kind of basically sail through it, not bother anybody, even if he knows that he's not liked by some of those actors. And Fathi Bashara, who was associated with this notion of anti-crime, the serious, authentic, likable anti-crime figure, making PowerPoint presentations in Washington, in London, in the Netherlands, in France. You know, who is he allied with? He's allied with some of those organized crime actors in northwestern Libya today. He's also allied with Haftar. Haftar runs effectively as I said earlier, parts of the armed coalition that he leads does useful stuff, you know, some authentic counterterrorism, good security in some areas, but at the same time needs to generate money. I mean, from that angle, doesn't hesitate to get involved, sometimes directly, in the classical illicit activities that I mentioned earlier. So you could argue that it's an organized crime empire in its own right. That's now an ally of Aki Bashara, who used to be known for his commitment to anti-crime crackdown and law enforcement in general. So effectively what we are seeing now is tensions in Libya rising as part of this rivalry between those two main camps. There are other camps, but those are the main ones, trying to grab the central institutions in Tripoli. And both have shown, in their own way, a willingness to coexist and even work actively with organized crime actors. So this is a relatively recent phenomenon. It's always been the case, but right now it's quite overt. The organized crime actors have become effectively a central political force that basically participate in the most mainstream aspects of Libyan political life. So is there a future for Libya without these kind of actors? Is there a serious policy conducted by foreign states to exert pressure on them? Have you heard of any condemnation recently in terms of really naming and shaming some of those big names? I haven't noticed any. So this is basically a trend that I wanted to kind of highlight before Jérôme is able to really get down to business and talk about his own detailed report. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jalel. That's great. Let me move it to here so that you can speak, Jérôme. So thanks so much for setting the context. I think it's going to be super useful as we dive into the more specifics of the situation of migrants who are in Libya. So if you want to take over already, and then we can take your questions and see what else you want to talk about.
Sure, many thanks, and thanks for the survey, and especially for organizing and inviting us. So I'm advisor currently for NSF France operations on refugee issues, and as well advocacy manager focusing on what we call the Out of Libya initiative. The report is just a little part of it. It's also an operational initiative to try to find very practical operational solutions to help better our target population of migrant patients in Libya. And prior to this, I've done a lot of research on the region, including a lot for the small arms survey. So there are a few reports here as well, other reports for the survey, which I think it was really interesting because we're working earlier for the survey on different issues and different countries. I think we could really prove that many issues were truly transnational regarding it, and that indeed when you talk about migration, you have to understand the context in a very advanced way. You have to understand the policies, and you have to understand indeed some transnational issues, and including sometimes other smuggling and trafficking issues, but also simply sometimes purely legal, political contexts or illicit which have a lot of influence on journeys, trajectories, and policies. So on the report, obviously, we didn't focus very much on the context. Somehow others have done it, and we assume that their work has been read, and also Jalel has been doing it very well, thanks. So I also think it's a bit, sometimes it can be really misleading to, when you discuss migration, to focus on, or to have your lens focusing on organized crime or anti-trafficking. Even those words can be very misleading. Not least in a context where migrants are criminalized. So what's the distinction between the real criminals and the migrants themselves, criminalized by both Libyan law very much inherited from Gaddafi, and which is also a problem for Libyans themselves, since it's not been really reformed, and also criminalized by European policies, by new European policies. And rescuers as well, including NGOs, are also criminalized, this time by European policies. So we beware a little bit of this vocabulary. I also think that looking at migration as an issue of numbers and flows is also very much misleading. Numbers you can, numbers you can make them tell what you want, truly, including when you talk about flows for actually relatively small numbers of people. And then we rather looked at the issue in terms of human rights, of course, and humanitarian terms, but also in terms of protection, because protection is something entitling some legal requirements, but also humanitarian practices on the ground. And we looked at the lack of protection in Libya. We looked at the description of Libya by all foreign actors as a place which is not safe for migrants, and as a place where you cannot protect them, as a place where they are victims of mass crimes. And in the meantime, we looked at, that's very much what we've been doing in the report, at responses. We looked at those responses not just now, but over a period of, let's say, 4 or 5 years. European policies started to have impact on Libya and on the Mediterranean and on countries around Libya around 2016. That's when also the flows across Libya and the Mediterranean peaked. And then in the meantime, incidentally or on purpose, humanitarian actors started to be deployed in Libya and to focus on migration altogether. So we looked at their achievements or the lack of them. We looked at how those responses, which were not necessarily fully coordinated, even so from the perspective of the main donors, they could be part of the same set of responses, but in fact they were often standardized and not really implemented in any coordinated way, good or bad. So those responses included migration flows management. They in Libya and outside Libya, in the sea and south of Libya. And they included anti-trafficking, so more support to anti-trafficking, and they included refugee resettlements. And those were the main responses, as well as voluntary return. They all look somehow inadequate, inadapted to the situation. Somehow they already recorded many failures or even counterproductive efforts in the context of Libya and around Libya. So our understanding as NSF of the situation in Libya and of the situation of migrants in Libya is mostly based on our operations. So they are limited and they've been evolving over time. They are relatively new. They also really began to focus on migrants in 2016-17. But I would say they're limited, but in the meantime they're not that limited. I mean, our access has been relatively good, surprisingly somehow, and supported by different actors in Libya, including the authorities, but also local communities. And they are relatively easy. I would say Libya is a difficult context because you witness violence, but Libya is not that a difficult context for NSF typical humanitarian operations. Security is relatively good, access is relatively good, so we believe we could do more and everyone could do more somehow. Notwithstanding the fact that at times, maybe currently, the space can shrink. The space is to be negotiated all the time, but this is pretty much normal in any humanitarian context. Even when or where the violence is exceptional, I do not see Libya as an exceptional context in terms of humanitarian access. It's not more difficult than in any war zone. To describe you a little bit our operations, where we are based or have been based over time is in different locations, mostly in the northwest of Libya since 2016-17, and that included Tripoli, and then maybe to maybe I should move to describe the map. So we've been based in the east of Tripoli, all along that stretch of coast, focusing quite a bit on Misrata. And on the coast, in detention centers in Zaitan, Homs, and Souk al-Khamis nearby, Tripoli, of course. And then we started to deploy on the west coast up to Zouara in the Tunisian border, where we're still based, and trying to get access to different key locations for migrant detention or smuggling on the coast, including Sabrata and Zawiya, but it's been uneven, it's been more occasional. And then we started also to work in key locations for migrants, either on their rooms or because there are detention centers, sometimes a bit unstable, in the hinterland south of Tripoli mostly. So along an arc going from Zouara to Misrata. We've been working in, and are still working in Beni Walid, which is quite a difficult location, but actually not that difficult to work in, and very interesting. I think we can do a lot of good work for migrants there. We've been working along the road from Beni Walid to the Jebel Nefusa here, and we've been working in the Jebel Nefusa in different locations, but mostly one main detention center. And we've been working in Garian also, it's a bit, let's say, east of those mountains, and as well in Biharan, which is here, and also more occasionally different small locations in the internet. So, as I said, that's limited, but still that gave us a little bit of an experience of the situation faced by the migrants. In addition to which, so we've been working in detention centers, but not only, we've also been working at humanitarians in Libya used to call it communities, but that means everything and not much, but that means in places, I would say, where migrants were actually not detained, basically living freely with different arrangements, which could be very, sometimes very unstable or precarious, and sometimes relatively acceptable. And then we've been also working at disembarkation points that are the ports where migrants intercepted at sea, mostly by the Libyan Coast Guard, are disembarked and need also healthcare. We also had, over time, we always had a boat, a rescue boat at sea, with different names and different boats. Today it's called the Geovarants, and also it's quite a crucial place to understand the situation at sea and on the ground. So the first thing we provide, of course, is medical aid, and it's much needed because most of our patients have been victims of torture, in particular of the quite systemic practice in Libya of torture for ransom, in particular systemic for sub-Saharan migrants and refugees and asylum seekers. So many of our patients also suffered from disease contracted in detention, typically tuberculosis, very widespread, and of course mats and troubles particularly widespread. Most had long experiences of successive detentions, mostly at traffickers' hands. So that's not in what we call the detention centers, which are the official detention centers. But many of our patients also had experience of successive detentions, often after the trafficking period, in official detention centers. Also, a number of them went through forced labor, and a very large number of them, as well, a very large share, tried to cross the sea because it's the main, honestly, the main way out. And increasingly over years, many were intercepted, not only one time, but 1, 2, 3, 5 times. It's quite common actually. So many had those experiences of repeated interceptions or pushbacks at sea. So for our teams on the ground, it proved very difficult to properly treat and rehabilitate those patients within it, just simply because they remained at risk in Libya. So that's why we also developed, which is relatively uncommon for NSF, a protection component within our operations. That included attempts at sheltering patients, rather than, for instance, returning them to detention or leaving them in the street. But we made those attempts, and others, including UN institutions, made those attempts. Some attempts failed, others were a bit more successful, but I would say that all attempts remained very limited and very fragile. There is one thing, it's that Libya is not safe for migrants. And those attempts at sheltering, actually, I think were very revealing, even to those within the UN systems who were a bit more optimistic. Still, many of those international players involved in Libya, they made the statement, but they preferred not to act upon the statement. So we truly believe there is a need for a different response, an appropriate response, which does include, in the short to mid-term, increasing and improving evacuations out of Libya. There are, of course, other policy responses which should be made, and many other players focus on those, but other responses probably are more long-term. I mean, true policy change, state building will take a lot of time. Evacuations can be done relatively quickly. So there already are evacuations taking place from Libya in different ways, under different names. Currently there are two main existing ways out of Libya. One is the IOM, the International Organization for Migration's voluntary return program to country of origin. And the other is the UNHCR resettlement and evacuation activities, programs to third countries in Europe and North America, sometimes through transit countries, sometimes directly. So since 2017 as NSF, we actually saw these mechanisms starting, and we referred cases to both. So IOM has somehow an advantage. They have no limitations in terms of numbers, and they have no limitations in terms of nationalities. So, fair enough, anyone who wants to return home can be returned through that process. The UNHCR process is more complicated because it has limited slots, and that's mostly limited by third countries' lack of appetite for giving slots. This year looks like particularly limited. I mean, the specific slots for Libya as of just a bit more than 300, and it's mostly in one country, Sweden. So that's a bit worrying because it's already half of the year. Let's hope. It will change in the next months, but we really don't know. So we've been asking for more slots, especially this year, and for more slots from Libya. I mean, some slots are included in a kind of global package, I would describe it that way. It's resettlement worldwide, so from many places. And classical resettlement is mostly organized, and we've seen it taking place from other conflict areas where we've been working, mostly organized from refugee camps and from countries where refugees are recognized as such and relatively safe, even if camp life is rarely paradise, but you can stay in a camp for a long time without necessarily risking your life. But resettlement from Libya, unlike from refugee camps elsewhere, is actually the main way out of Libya for refugees who cannot return home without risking their life. And as such, that mechanism has clearly a very different impact. I mean, it's even if it's far from perfect, it's saving lives, which is not the case from the typical resettlements from elsewhere. So besides number, as I mentioned, the numbers are limited because of third countries' willingness. But there is another main limitation in that process, which is really specific to Libya. It's that in Libya, the UNHCR resettlement process is only accessible to people from 9 nationalities. And well, I should call the nationalities. I mean, four of them are from the Middle East. It's Iraq, Palestine, Syria, and Yemen. 5 of them are from Sub-Saharan Africa: Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia, Sudan, and South Sudan. They're all from the Horn of Africa. This limitation is due to, it's a limitation fixed by the Libyan authorities, not the current Libyan authorities, but past governments. But it's also based on negotiations, so there still should be room for more negotiation, because Nigeria could, at times, negotiate from 2 more nationalities. I mean, it should not be only the duty of Nigeria, but other players should actually negotiate to enlarge that space and face the issue that for Sub-Saharan Africa, even so the Horn of Africa, it's certainly a main place for refugees, but it's not the only one. I mean, there are war zones and true refugees coming from West Africa. But that division is actually feeding the idea, which is very common in Europe, that Horn of Africa people are good refugees. They truly are trying to escape from wars, but that in Mali or Central African Republic there is no war to escape, or that in Chad there is no dictatorial regime to run away from, which, well, is questionable, at least. So, another caveat to this current system is that UNHCR lacks access to locations in Libya. I mean, I showed you where NSF was working. Access to UNHCR for registration for an asylum seeker is limited currently to Tripoli. And they also stopped, they have their ethical reasons, they stopped registering in detention centers, which to us is a bit of a problem because there are people in detention centers who should be registered and who could easily be registered. And finally, the resettlement process is quite slow. So it may, as I mentioned, very well be adapted, including its pace, to refugee camps and safe places around the world, but it's not adapted to Libya because it's not a safe place. And given the considerable time that mechanism takes, contacts with even registered persons of concern, it's the name they're called in that context, are easily lost. So many lives are lost too, at sea or on the ground, including the lives of people who have been or are about to be selected to board on an evacuation flight, but are out of contact. So this is why we call as an asset not only for increasing slots, but also for complementing resettlement with more adapted processes for the most vulnerable. And so we tried a few things, and we learned from experience. We're still learning. So the first thing we tried since 2018 is we tried to refer cases to embassies, and we succeeded in getting humanitarian visas for a few medical cases. Of course, it would be much easier if embassies were based in Tripoli rather than in Tunis with consulate services and so on. But still, I mean, there's a lot you can do because ultimately it's a matter of political will in capitals in Europe and North America. It's not a matter of just law and policy. And then we tried to advocate for what we call humanitarian corridors, which in effect is just an extension of the humanitarian visas processes to a larger number of people. And so since November, there is an existing humanitarian corridor with that name, which opens from Libya to Italy by the Italian government in agreement with the UNHCR and Italian charities for 500 people over a year, and with, in principle, larger, more open criteria than other evacuation and resettlement processes, more open in terms of nationalities, more open in terms of vulnerabilities. So, for instance, in the most recent third flight of that corridor, it took place a few days ago, on June 30. We had 27 patients from NSF in Libya who were evacuated directly to Italy. The total flight was 93 people, passengers. And so it's quite good. Like, honestly, it's an unprecedented, it's small, but it's an unprecedented number. Because we never succeeded in getting that large number, so we hope to continue and even to do more. But that will be also, I think, some struggle. We also saw already, besides the success, the difficulties in that existing model, because in principle it's open to any nationalities, but because the UNHCR is still the main player, and that they are in principle not allowed to register people outside of the 9 nationalities, it proved still very difficult to evacuate people on that corridor from outside of the 9 nationalities. Of those 27, only 4 were from other nationalities than the 9. Included Cameroon, Guinea, and Djibouti. So in addition, there is another difficulty is that the registration with the difficulty for UNHCR to access other places than Tripoli, since they are the ones who ultimately control the list, it's not easy for someone not already registered and thus from someone not based in Tripoli to get access to those flights. So somehow we should think of other mechanisms. One thing which is very positive in that mechanism, especially from the perspective of a player like NSF, is that On those 27 cases, 14 will be received by MSF Italy in their specialized Center for Victims of Torture in Sicily. And MSF will also ensure medical follow-up of the 13 others, so ensuring for the first time continuity of care. So what's interesting in that model is that charities are also sponsors and reception actors in Italy for a share of the beneficiaries. And we see how much that's helpful because already governments had positive experiences with similar corridors. Some governments see that it's less a burden financially. Some governments see the quality. Some governments see that it's more accepted by local societies, communities, precisely because it does involve local communities in Europe. So we've been proposing since about a year similar models to some governments, similar models of complementary pathways. Some call it complementary pathways. I mean, all terms are disputable and of limited value. Some call it a corridor, others call it private sponsorship. It depends very much on which country, which government you talk to, which country you are dealing with. But the model itself that we're proposing is mostly based on already existing corridors working from Lebanon, with which some countries in Europe and North America had very positive experiences. So what's interesting in that model is that NGOs can contribute to both reception and identification of the most vulnerable patients in Libya, including medical cases who need a quick evacuation. So we see that latest model as more efficient, but regardless, there are many ways by which evacuations of migrants in Libya could be both increased and improved. So basically, we've been trying to complete different sets of, a whole set of recommendations, but on quite different grounds. Of course, we are also conveying to decision makers in safe countries, host countries, to multilateral organizations, including the European Union, the United Nations, and their agencies in charge of refugees and migrants, recommendations to properly address what we see as a human rights crisis. Some do require important policy changes, such as, for instance, revising and better understanding the impact of the European cooperation with Libyan migration. Because we also are our Libyan colleagues and counterparts, including within the authorities and civil society actors, they are not necessarily happy to be seen as a subcontractor of an essentially European policy with mostly European interests. So we think there will be a way to completely reframe those policies, taking into account human rights, but also Libyan concerns. So, and then that will take time, I'm afraid. So we came with other, smaller, maybe less ambitious recommendations, which are those concrete proposals for more efficient evacuations out of Libya. And so we recommended to be a little bit more innovative, ambitious with those humanitarian corridors, and to work with NGOs and civil society organizations, because for different reasons they can play a role, reception, identification. And then, of course, we also are happy if some governments want to propose more slots to existing mechanisms in spite of their limitations. So mostly that's an attempt to prioritize, for our response, prioritizing human rights based on the realities on the ground, rather than just a global policy. And so based on what we see as not an issue of migration management, but one of mass crimes. And so that's pretty much, I think, what we hope to convince people to move with. And I think it's very important for that to revise our understanding of the Libyan context in the sense Jalel argues. Correct.
Thank you, Jérôme and Jalel. I think it's very interesting how you both touched on very different levels and aspects of crime within these contexts. So, how you ended your presentation, Jérôme. So I thought we could open it up to questions and make this really a conversation. I have a bunch of my own, but if anyone in the audience wants to start, I shouldn't take advantage of my position just because I'm by the mic. Does anyone already now have a thought?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentations. Jérôme, I had a question for you, where does the European Union stand on this situation? Because when you talked about the pushbacks and the border, which is illegal in terms of human rights, and also, I mean, this externalization of borders of the European Union towards the Libyan and also Moroccan Melilla and Ceuta, where migrants get to these places and they are pushed back or spend years and their rights are violated. Where is European Union stand in front of this human rights violations? I mean, is there? Do they know about it? Do they take it into account?
So just because I'm not sure where the mic is, this mic in terms of picking up what you said. So the question is about where the EU stands and the externalization of borders and the EU's position on that. And I know Jalel has things to say on this too, but would you like to start and then?
I don't, well, of course, the European Union is not necessarily united. It depends if we talk of member states, not united, some trying to move, but others not following. There is a commission with different services and directions, with different goals. I mean, the DG Home, which is managing the migration, does not have necessarily the same use on Libya than the External Action Service. And there is a parliament as well, of course. And of course, there are political changes taking place on a regular basis in Europe, and they can also influence. But mostly, I say, when they look at the numbers, the European Union is relatively satisfied. They started really, well, they started work on the file a long time ago, but they started to be a little bit panicked on the file in 2015 when numbers truly peaked. We were at 180,000. Well, first they peaked in, of course, between Turkey and Greece, but then after the European Union tackled the issue with the EU-Turkey deal, there was criticism on it as well, but still a different context. They looked at Libya as a second place in terms of numbers, with in 2016, if I'm not wrong, 180,000 crossing. I mean, if you look, so they rushed to negotiate with a very newly formed government, which at the time had not even set foot in Tripoli. But the migration was brought onto the table the day the government was formed, basically, very quickly. So that's probably too quickly to have a serious deal, regardless of the seriousness of the deal with Turkey. At least the Turkish government had some former history and experience. But, so that was made in a rush, in a frenzy, and it was actually made by Italy, who was definitely on the front line and definitely panicked. But then, and they negotiated not only with the government, but because the government was not in full control, they negotiated with a bunch of local players, municipalities, armed players, and so on. And we may not know everything. So they just looked at the number. What the main thing they did was to give a search and rescue zone to Libya, in spite of the lack of united government. And also, I think in spite of the clear lack of understanding, at least at the beginning, from Libyan players, of what it actually entitled to be in charge of a search and rescue zone, which is not only, I think sometimes some Libyan players understood it as an extension of their territorial waters, while actually it's entitling to legal obligations of rescue, which is fully different, in a completely crazy context, because Libyans were tasked to do the rescue, but they were not supposed to bring back the migrants to Libya. What should they do? So in terms of numbers, Europe can be satisfied because so they started when numbers crossing were 180,000, and since that time, since 2017, the numbers of people who crossed were of 180,000. So in 5 years, the same number than in 1 year. It's been slightly increasing last year, but that remains very small numbers. And also more interestingly, it's been efficient because the rate of interceptions have been growing ever since to about, numbers are not fully accurate, but let's say to about 50%. In the report, we tried to put a table summarizing and putting those numbers in perspective as best as we could, still knowing that those numbers are uncertain. But still, you can have an idea of the scale at least, and the variations over years. The rate of interception has truly increased. The number of deaths at sea has decreased in absolute numbers, but the rate has increased. For different reasons, but mostly because basically while delegating rescue efforts to the Libyan Coast Guard, which are not necessarily up to the task, the European Union are either withdrawn their own military efforts, but also put pressure on both rescue actors and commercial boats not to do those rescues. So that's one of the issues. Then, I think European Union is very well aware of the human rights impacts at sea and in Libya. I think they increasingly started to somehow care of it, or at least care of the risks that they could be targeted by accountability efforts in Europe. So that, I think, could encourage the European Union to be a little bit more cautious. Hoping cautious in the right sense of the term, I hope, and not trying to hide and subcontract ever more the same policies, but like clearly putting human rights a bit higher in the agenda. I think the European Union, or at least some member states who are involved in Libya and the region, have also been concerned by side effects, including the fact that in the context of Libya, but not only Libya, but also outside Libya, the similar anti-migration policies could actually end being counterproductive and encourage players who either are playing double game and whose activities do include truly anti-trafficking, but also trafficking, and also could encourage players who may not be involved in trafficking at all, but may be also involved in other dangerous activities or be violent themselves, with impact not only on migrants but on Libya itself, Libyans in Libya, and on other countries as well. So there is, I think, a typical example. A lot of the lack of understanding and even dialogue between the European Union and other actors on that issue, I think, is based on the fact that the categories are not working. Like, for instance, I take the example of Sudan because it's a very good example where the same policy started a bit earlier and where Sudanese actors had maybe somehow, let's say, an older experience at manipulating different foreign players in order to get political and financial support. So presenting themselves, Sudan's, the history of the survival of the past Sudanese regime, of the former Sudanese regime, has been largely based on their ability at bargaining between different players, using especially anti-terrorism, presenting themselves very quickly in the 1990s as I would be the first to cooperate with the West against terror, even before 2001. And that's been very efficient. That's been a truly survival strategy, truly efficient. And then migration became number two, less important, but still important, not that much with the US, but with the EU. So the EU defense for their policy on Sudan, and Sudan was the capital of the Horn of Africa migration policy for the EU, was to say, we do not work with militias, we work with regular forces. Well, the problem is today, first the problem is regular forces have been no less abusive in the history of Sudan. They were the ones who, militias didn't have planes, they didn't have those planes bombing civilians. That was the regular army. So, and now today, people who are leading Sudanese militias are part of the Sudanese state. They become regular players. So what did you do? The second defense from the EU was saying we work with the police, as if the police was less abusive than the army. But today, in the current repression in Sudan of civilian protesters, the militia smartly led the police in the front line. So the players who have been trained by the European Union on human rights are doing the repression of civilian protesters, including their units called the Central Reserve Police, which is militia, but police militia. And that unit, I'm quoting that example because I think that's a good lesson learned for other contexts. That unit has been recently sanctioned by the US government, not for what they did in war zones, but for the repression of the protests. So what will the European Union do? Will they remain blind on the warning, or will they start to understand that that actually has implications, including legal implications?
Thank you, Jérôme. Jalel, I'm keen to hear what you
Sorry for
think.
being long.
Yeah, just very briefly, I think what Jérôme said about the statistics, you know, roughly 12, 13,000 migrants arriving on an irregular basis in Sicily before this watershed moment of July or August 2017. So before that, it was like roughly 12,000, 13,000 a month. And after that, it basically just fell off a cliff. And during the war, even despite the war, 2019, 2020, the war against Tripoli, the statistics were very low. It was roughly 1,000 or a little bit more a month. And if you add now the Tigray war in November 2020 and all these other phenomena, the rise that we've seen over the last 18 months have been basically, it's been an increase from typically 1,500 a month to a little bit more than 3,000. So the European Union remembers, and that's what Jérôme said, is that the picture today is much less stressful than before the summer of 2017. So what happened is that the behavior of some of the most crucial armed groups was somehow altered. As Jérôme said, we don't know the story. But the bottom line is that before that moment, they were actually focusing 110% on facilitating the flow. And they were convinced to move to another business model, which is not 100% about blocking the flow. Block the flow, you know, 70% of the time or 80% of the time. And if you have within your armed group people involved in facilitating the flow, then it's okay. So this way you kind of pay some of those people. And very importantly, more important than money, is that you have had this dynamic where the European member states and the European Union itself, every time those people talk to Libyan authorities, whether it's the Tripoli government or other militias or Haftar himself, who is recognized almost like a legitimate form of the Libyan state, every time there's a conversation, the Europeans insist on how crucial it is for those Libyan actors to continue enjoying the favors of foreign states if they carry on fulfilling that role of blocking. So this means that the formal authorities in Libya know that foreign states really care a lot, and armed groups, when they go to the formal government, they use that. So it's basically a source of legitimacy, it's a source of officialdom, it's a source of people, and you are effectively a vital organ that the formal institutions must remain partnered with. So this political, it's more of a political dynamic sometimes than a financial one. The money matters, but it's, believe me, this business is not the most important one within the illicit world in Libya. I think that's something that we should do.
Thanks for that. Do we have any more questions from the audience?
Of course. Then I would, thank you very much for the presentation. I was just wondering about, do you have any idea about the figures and trends of IDPs inside Libya? Because I think in the report you mentioned a huge number, say about 600,000 refugees, but what about the IDPs and the trends? Suppose they're from the east to the west, but do you have any idea? Interesting. Plus, you mentioned something about NGOs and their possible role in this regard. Do you mean international NGOs, local NGOs? To what extent they would be involved in this thing? Privatization of humanitarian work? Yes, thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks, Bill. So the questions about the figures on IDPs as well as the types of NGOs that we're discussing and their role. So would you like to start?
Sure. So I think in terms of IDPs, you can view it as a series of tragedies that have not been resolved since February 2011. And each tragedy involves roughly somewhere between 5,000 all the way to 50,000 people. We've had some Tuareg who were displaced out of Adamas. In 2011, we've had, of course, the very famous case of Tawarga, 30,000 people near Misrata, still not resolved. Very few have returned. You've had all the people expelled from Benghazi who now, some of the richest ones live in Istanbul, but you've had poor ones in areas like Tajura and other parts of Tripoli. You have remnants of the people displaced by the Tripoli war that still haven't returned. I mean, a lot of them have returned, but you probably have a good 20% that still haven't returned. And then you have, of course, the Morzuk case, the exactions that were carried out in February 2019. And a lot of them are in places like Sabratha and are not even interested in returning, actually. They cannot for political reasons, but even if they could, because the situation within Morzuk is slightly better now, and a lot of them have basically learned how to live in Sabratha. Like the Tuareg I mentioned, some of them live in Zuwara. So what I'm trying to say is that Libya has effectively acquired a tradition of not resolving most of its IDP situations. And this is problematic. For example, if you look at the Benghazi people that I'm talking about, they have been able to survive in Tripoli because they know that there's no trace of Haftar in Tripoli. If Fathi Bashar, the prime minister that I mentioned, were to somehow prevail in Tripoli, you would have a war specifically targeted at these people who are not even at home now, have survived in difficult conditions in Tripoli, and they would still be cracked down upon simply because of the history, not because of the ideology, but they already lost a lot of what they owned. And so this trend of not resolving the IDP situation, I think, is quite bothersome. It should be alarming.
I don't know the current number of IDPs, but it's regularly updated, like for migrants I think mostly by IOM, but we don't really know if those numbers are accurate. I mean, they are based on collection of data in locations even where the agency does not have access, actually. So generally speaking, I think we should be very careful on numbers. Even those 600,000, it's a number that's been circulating over the years, and I'm not sure on what it's based. It may be more. Like when I speak to the Sudanese embassy, in Libya, at some point they told me it should rather be 500,000 Sudanese in Libya, and that's possible. But they're not all counted, but what we should avoid is making people in the current context, political context, is that there are 600,000 people, foreigners in Libya, and because of 600,000, they include also Egyptians, Moroccans, 600,000 who should leave Libya right now, because that's not the case. It's more complicated than that. We know that the UNHCR registers people from 9 nationalities as persons of concern, and they have a constant, quasi-constant number of 40,000 registered. Also, they keep registering, so people disappear and are delisted. But you could feel that even though they're registered, some nationalities are well represented. Like I think the Eritrean community in Libya has been relatively well registered, which is good. They could find access. At least that was the case when I looked at those rates a few years ago. But the Sudanese, for instance, you can guess they should be registered in principle, or they can be registered. And 40,000 for all nationalities means very few Sudanese have been registered. So why? Maybe some don't want to be registered. They don't care. They're working in Libya. Okay. And maybe others just don't have access, which is why still more could be registered and should be registered. At least those 40,000 is giving you a better idea of people in need than those 600,000. Let's say the real need is somewhere in between.